Hi everyone, nice to see you all. Thanks for coming back to the channel. Usually when I talk about things on this channel, I feel that I've formulated some sort of reasonably decent answer to the question that I'm asking before I start making the video. In this video, I don't think I have an answer to this question, so I'm just going to throw it out there because it's interesting to me and maybe other people have more interesting or useful or insightful things to say on this topic. Basically, what I want to talk about today is language interference, L1 interference in foreign language learning. And I want to put forward the idea that the extent to which it creates a problem for us is, in an interesting and slightly peculiar fashion, a function of how far removed the language we're learning is from our own language. It seems to me that if you're learning a language that's very closely related to your own native language, let's say you're Spanish and you want to learn Portuguese, that is probably quite an easy thing to do. There will be, of course, L1 interference from your own native language, which is to say Spanish, but on net balance, the two languages are so similar that L1 interference might even be helpful in a sense. To the extent that your brain is working in Spanish when you try and speak Portuguese, in the grand scheme of things, that's actually going to help a lot because the languages are so close to each other. At the other end of the spectrum, you have, say, a native Spanish speaker trying to learn Japanese. Now, language interference, L1 interference, can operate on different levels, phonetically, lexically, grammatically, but certainly at the grammatical level, Japanese and Spanish, or Japanese and any other European language for that matter, are so far removed from each other that there's a limit to how much language interference you can actually get at that level. It's very difficult to try and structure a Japanese sentence in a Spanishy type way, and the converse is also true. If you're Japanese and you're trying to speak Spanish, then it's not obvious how you would even try and drag the grammar of Japanese across into Spanish. So if you take, for example, Spanish forms like the conditional, let's take, for example, tener, to have, right? Yo tendría, tú tendrías, él, ella tendría, and all that sort of stuff. No Spanish speaker is accidentally going to start saying things like that in Japanese when they learn Japanese, because those forms simply do not exist. Nobody's going to try and drag that across into Japanese. Similarly, a Japanese person trying to learn Spanish is not going to start inserting their postpositional grammatical particles, wa, ga, o, ni, de, and so on and so forth, into their Spanish sentences, because they just know that they're not going to do anything there. There's no point trying to shove that stuff into a Spanish sentence. It doesn't mean anything. It seems to me that there's a nasty sweet spot in the negative sense of the term. It's a sort of negative sweet spot. There's a nasty sweet spot in the middle there when languages that we're trying to learn, the languages that we're trying to learn, are substantially removed from our own native languages, but not so far removed that we can't at least try to pull our own grammar across into them. That may sound a little bit confusing, but let me give you a concrete example of what I'm talking about. I've spent a lot of time studying Russian. I started studying Russian about 8 years ago, in fact, a long time ago, and I've studied it pretty intensively, and my Russian is quite good today. I also teach English to Russian speakers online, not only to Russian speakers, but usually to Russian speakers. So any mistake that a Russian speaker can make trying to speak English, believe me, I've heard it about 8,000 times. And because I know Russian and understand Russian, I can usually figure out why they're making the mistakes that they make when they speak English. And many of those mistakes are obviously a direct consequence of language interference. Grammatically and lexically, the extent of the L1 interference is overwhelmingly clear, and it is a serious degree of interference. But when I speak English to Japanese people, there isn't that much going on there that stands out to me as obviously having been influenced by Japanese. That's not to say that they speak English well. They may speak it very badly. They may say stuff that is virtually gobbledygook. They may struggle tremendously, but it is not obvious that those struggles stem from the way Japanese works. They stem rather from the fact that English and Japanese are very alien, and they just can't formulate their thoughts properly at all in English. I'm talking about people at quite a low level here, right? I'm not talking about everyone. The thing about Russian is that it is, of course, a European language, an Indo-European language more specifically. And that relatively deep, fundamental structural similarity between Russian and English at least allows you to try and drag your own grammar across into this foreign language that you're learning. So if you're learning Russian as an English speaker or English as a Russian speaker, you still have the option, if I can put it like that, of being strongly disrupted by your own native language. When you learn Japanese as a Brit, like I learned it many years ago, you realize quite quickly, if you're paying attention, that you are going to have to learn to formulate your thoughts in a radically different fashion, or you're not going to get anywhere. If you try and formulate your thoughts in an English fashion, you're just going to come up with complete gobbledygook that from the perspective of a Japanese person isn't even going to be wrong, it's just going to be gobbledygook, right? There's a level of wrongness beyond which the natives won't even really be able to perceive us as speaking their language, but with mistakes. They will just perceive what we say as being gobbledygook. At the other end of the spectrum, if we go back to a hypothetical Spanish person learning Portuguese, there is a level of similarity where L1 interference is essentially helpful, because if you guess that your target language works the same way as your own language, most of the time you'll be pretty close to being accurate in that language. This unfortunate sweet spot between those two extremes, and I think that someone like myself learning Russian, or a Spanish person learning Russian, would be quite a good example of it. That unfortunate sweet spot can probably create a sort of barrier that many people never get past, because they're very strongly pushed in the wrong direction by language interference in its many forms and manifestations, but the mistakes they make allow them to be close enough to some sort of comprehensible sentence structure that often they will be more or less comprehensible. And if they perceive that, if they can see that they're basically being more or less understood most of the time, at least by people who are used to the way they talk, then they don't have the same incentives to try and correct these many mistakes that they're making. And I do notice when I speak to Russian-speaking students, there are so many persistent errors, so many fossilized errors in the way they speak that grow out of their own L1, out of Russian in other words, that sometimes I just despair of ever being able to help them with these mistakes. It takes a real effort of will to try and stop making mistakes like that, where you get the sense that you're more or less comprehensible despite the fact that you're actually not speaking correctly or accurately. So my claim here is not that it's harder for a British person like me to learn Russian than it is to learn Japanese. Japanese, being so alien, is still a bigger challenge on net balance. I'm not talking about the writing system here, I'm just talking about getting to grips with Japanese grammar, basically, the fundamental sentence structures of Japanese. No, Japanese is still a bigger challenge, but you know it's a challenge, and you know that if you don't solve that challenge, you will not be comprehensible at all in Japanese. Whereas Russian, yeah, it's a long way away, but if you cobble together some sort of half-assed Russian sentence on the basis of the way English works, maybe you'll make something that's more or less comprehensible, and maybe that'll undermine your desire to try and improve your accuracy. And the converse is also true, I think. So the difficulties of Japanese will be more likely to simply crush people and induce them to give up, to quit Japanese. Whereas the difficulties of something like Russian will not be so crippling, but they will often result in a sort of slightly garbagey pigeon type Russian that people will nod at and smile at if they want to be polite, but that remains stuck forever at that sort of level. And I wonder sometimes if the extreme grammatical alienness of a language like Japanese, from our perspective, is something that forces us to either learn it a bit more correctly or just give up in a way that would not necessarily be true with something like Russian. That's just speculation, you know. I don't know. But when I listen to Japanese people, I just don't hear that much that seems like it comes from Japanese grammatically, structurally. I hear some things. You know, I've read comments by Japanese people where they've put a modifying phrase in front of the noun that it modifies. So instead of saying information that I didn't know, a Japanese person will write, Sam gave me a lot of I didn't know information. Because in Japanese, the I didn't know bit is going to go in front of the information. It's not going to go after. It's not going to be coordinated with a relative pronoun like that information that I didn't know. They're just going to shove it all in front of the noun. And I've read comments like that, and you can say, oh, she's written this the Japanese way. They do things like that. It would be interesting to study this a bit more rigorously. But if there's a conclusion here, and I think there is a conclusion, it's that a very grammatically alien language will either force you to learn it somewhat more accurately than another European language, or it'll just crush you completely and you will give it up because you realize that you're not going anywhere with it. But there's something about English and Russian. I think there's an awkward distance between them. They are different enough that it's very difficult to learn this alien grammar well, moving in either direction, but they're similar enough that you can kind of try and bodge your way through by speaking some weird hybrid of the target language and your own language. And it seems to me that is perhaps uniquely unhelpful for a certain type of language learner. Anyway, that's it. That was me blethering, just thinking out loud, really. Thanks for listening this far. If there's anything you'd like to say in response, any questions you want to ask, any observations you want to make, you are very welcome, of course, to do so in the comments. So thanks for listening. I'll see you all again soon, and ciao, bye bye.